want you to try something right now before we go any further. Not later, not after the video, but right now in this moment. Put your phone face down, turn off whatever music you have playing, remove every layer of background noise you usually keep around you, and just sit there for 10 minutes with nothing but silence. No scrolling, no sound, no distraction, just you and whatever happens in your mind when nothing else is there to occupy it. You probably didn't do it, and that's fine, because if I'm being honest, neither did I the first time someone suggested it to me. I remember thinking it sounded simple, almost trivial, like something that shouldn't be a problem at all. And then without even realizing it, I picked up my phone within seconds to check something completely unimportant, something I don't even remember now. And that's exactly the point, because almost nobody actually does this when they're asked to. And even the people who try usually don't last very long before something dull but persistent pulls them back out of that silence. It's not dramatic, it's not overwhelming. It doesn't feel like panic or fear in the way you'd expect. It's quieter than that, almost background level, like a low hum of discomfort that you can't quite name but also can't quite ignore. And within a couple of minutes, sometimes even less, that feeling builds just enough that your hand moves almost automatically toward your phone, or you stand up for no real reason, or you something on have noise in the background. You don't make a conscious decision to escape the silence, you just find yourself no longer in it. And that moment, that almost invisible shift from stillness to distraction, is what this entire conversation is about. Because if you step back and look at it, it's actually a very strange pattern. We live in a time where stimulation is constant, where connection is immediate, where there is always something to watch, something to listen to, something to scroll through. We have access to more information, more entertainment, more content than any generation before us, and we carry it in our pockets at all times. There is never a moment where we are forced into silence unless we deliberately choose it. Any generation before us, and we carry it in our pockets at all times. There is never a moment where we are forced into silence unless we deliberately choose it, and yet despite all of that abundance, or maybe because of it, most people are deeply uncomfortable with doing nothing. Not bored in the casual sense, not just restless, but genuinely uneasy in a way that feels deeper than simple boredom. The strange part is that this discomfort doesn't feel like fear. It feels like preference. It feels like I just like having something on, or I focus better with music, or I'm just used to it. And all of those explanations sound completely reasonable on the surface. But if you take those explanations away and actually sit in silence long enough to see what happens underneath them, something always starts to emerge. Something that isn't about preference at all, and whatever that thing is, that's where this gets interesting. The experience itself is very consistent if you actually go through it. The first 30 seconds are usually fine, sometimes even pleasant, like putting down a weight you didn't realize you were carrying. Your body relaxes slightly, your breathing slows down, and there's a brief moment where it feels like nothing is wrong. But then, somewhere around the 1-minute mark, things start to shift. Not suddenly, not all at once, but gradually, like a slow drip. A thought appears, something small at first, maybe a memory from earlier in the week, maybe a conversation that didn't sit quite right, maybe a question you've been postponing. You notice it, maybe push it aside, and then another thought comes, and another. And before long, your attention is pulled in multiple directions at once. It starts to feel crowded, like your mind is no longer a quiet space, but a room where everything you've been ignoring has decided to show up at the same time. And somewhere between the 2nd and 5th minute, something changes again. You reach a point where the accumulation of those thoughts, that low-level pressure, becomes just uncomfortable enough that you want out. Not desperately, not urgently, but enough that you act on it. Your hand moves. You pick up your phone. You open something. You introduce noise back into the space, and almost immediately the discomfort fades. Enough that you act on it. Your hand moves. You pick up your phone. You open something. You introduce noise back into the space, and almost immediately the discomfort fades. The pressure disappears. The thoughts quiet down, and you feel normal again. And because it feels normal, you don't question it. But the real question is not why you felt better. It's why you felt uncomfortable in the first place. Because what actually happened in that moment wasn't boredom, and it wasn't a lack of focus. What happened is that when you removed every external source of stimulation, you were left alone with your own internal experience, with your thoughts, your feelings, the underlying state of your mind. And something about that direct, unfiltered contact was uncomfortable enough that you chose to interrupt it. Not the silence itself, but what the silence revealed. And that's where distraction plays a much bigger role than we usually acknowledge. Distraction is not just entertainment. It's not just something we use to pass time. It's a mechanism that keeps our attention occupied, that fills our cognitive space with something external. And as long as that space is filled, there's a buffer between us and what's happening internally. That buffer is incredibly effective, and more importantly, it's incredibly comfortable. Because what's underneath that buffer is not always easy to sit with. It's not necessarily dramatic or overwhelming. It's not always anxiety or sadness in a clear, recognizable form. Often it's quieter than that. It's unresolved thoughts, questions that haven't been answered, feelings that haven't been fully processed. It's things like wondering whether you're actually satisfied with the direction your life is going, or whether the things you're pursuing are genuinely meaningful to you, or whether there's something you've been avoiding that you haven't allowed yourself to fully look at. These are not loud thoughts, but they carry weight. And when you sit in silence long enough, they have a way of surfacing. And when they do, they don't just pass through your mind like background noise. They linger, they demand attention. They create a kind of internal pressure that is difficult to ignore once you've noticed it. And that pressure is exactly what most people are trying to avoid when they reach for distraction. Not consciously, not in a way they would describe as avoidance, but functionally that's what's happening. Is exactly what most people are trying to avoid when they reach for distraction. Not consciously, not in a way they would describe as avoidance, but functionally that's what's happening. If you look at a typical day, this pattern becomes even clearer. From the moment you wake up, there's usually some form of input. For many people, the first thing they do is check their phone, often before they've even had a fully independent thought. From there, the day continues with a constant stream of information. Music while getting ready, podcasts during a commute, notifications throughout the day, background noise during moments of rest. Even the spaces between activities are rarely empty, because those are the moments where people instinctively reach for their phones. By the time the day ends, there has been almost no point where the mind was left alone without external input, and over time, that becomes the default state. Not something unusual, not something intentional, just the way things are. Silence becomes unfamiliar, and unfamiliar experiences tend to feel uncomfortable, even if there's nothing inherently wrong with them. But the discomfort of silence is not just about unfamiliarity, it's about exposure. Silence removes the buffer. It removes the layer of distraction that normally sits between you and your own internal experience. And when that layer is gone, what remains is not empty space, but everything that was already there beneath the surface. This is something that becomes very clear in controlled settings as well. There was an experiment where people were asked to sit alone in a room for a short period of time with no distractions, no phone, no reading material, nothing to occupy their attention. And most participants reported that the experience was not just boring, but actively unpleasant. But what makes this particularly interesting is what happened when an alternative was introduced. Participants were given the option to press a button that would deliver a mild electric shock. They had experienced the shock beforehand and confirmed that they did not enjoy it. It was uncomfortable, something they would normally avoid. And yet, when left alone in silence with nothing but their thoughts, a significant number of people chose to press the button, not once, but multiple times. Would normally avoid. And yet, when left alone in silence with nothing but their thoughts, a significant number of people chose to press the button, not once, but multiple times. That detail matters because it shows that the discomfort of silence can be strong enough that people prefer a known physical discomfort over an uncertain internal experience. The shock is immediate, it's clear, it has a beginning and an end. Your thoughts, on the other hand, are less predictable, less controllable, and that lack of control creates a different kind of tension. And that tension is closely tied to identity. In everyday life, we exist within roles. We are defined by what we do, how we interact, how others perceive us. There is a structure that gives us a sense of stability, a sense of knowing who we are. But in silence, that structure is temporarily removed. There is no role to perform, no external feedback, no context to anchor your identity. There is only your internal experience. For many people, that experience feels uncertain, not because something is wrong, but because it hasn't been explored very often. When your sense of self is built largely on external factors, removing those factors can create a temporary gap, a sense that the underlying structure is less defined than you assumed. And that uncertainty is uncomfortable enough that the natural response is to restore the structure as quickly as possible. But that gap is not a problem. It's actually a more accurate representation of reality. The self is not fixed. It's not a single, stable construct that exists independently of context. It's dynamic, complex, often contradictory. And the only way to encounter that directly is to spend time in a state where external influence is minimized. This is where silence becomes more than just an absence of noise. It becomes a tool for observation, not in an abstract or theoretical sense, but in a direct experiential way. Over time, spending even short periods in silence allows patterns to emerge. You begin to notice what your mind returns to when it's not being directed by external input. You notice what it avoids, what it amplifies, what it minimizes. This kind of observation leads to a different type of understanding. It's not something that can be explained to you or given to you through information. It's something that develops through repeated exposure. Observation leads to a different type of understanding. It's not something that can be explained to you or given to you through information. It's something that develops through repeated exposure. And with that comes a shift in how you respond to your own thoughts. Instead of reacting immediately, instead of trying to suppress or escape them, you begin to create a small amount of space between the thought and the response. That space is subtle, but it's significant. It's the difference between reacting automatically and choosing how to respond. It's the difference between being driven by whatever arises in your mind and having some degree of influence over how you engage with it. And this connects to something much broader. In a culture that emphasizes constant movement, constant productivity, constant improvement, there is very little emphasis on stopping to evaluate direction. Movement becomes the default, and because movement feels like progress, it's rarely questioned. But movement without direction is not necessarily meaningful. Silence interrupts that pattern. It creates a moment where movement stops, where input stops, where there is an opportunity to observe what remains when all of that is removed. And what remains is often more informative than anything external. Because at the end of the day, everything that surfaces in silence is already part of your experience. It doesn't appear because you created it in that moment. It appears because you finally gave it space to be noticed. And that leads back to the original question. Why is it so difficult to sit in silence for 10 minutes? Not because it's physically demanding, not because it requires skill, but because it removes the distance between you and your own internal state. It removes the buffer. And without that buffer, you are left with everything that you have been carrying, whether you were aware of it or not. And the question is not whether that experience is comfortable. The question is whether it's something you're willing to engage with, because avoiding it doesn't remove it. It just keeps it out of view. So try it again, not as an abstract idea, not as something you might do later, but as something you actually experience. Sit in silence, notice what comes up, and instead of immediately leaving, stay for a moment longer than you normally would. Because what you're encountering in that space is not something new. Silence. Notice what comes up, and instead of immediately leaving, stay for a moment longer than you normally would. Because what you're encountering in that space is not something new. It's something that has been there the entire time. And understanding that even in a small way changes how you relate to everything else. But there is another layer to this that's even more subtle, and it has to do with how quickly we've adapted to a life where silence is optional. Not rare, not difficult to access, but completely optional. There was a time, not that long ago, when silence wasn't something you had to choose. It was something that simply existed between moments of activity. There were natural gaps in the day where nothing was happening. No input, no stimulation, just space. And in that space, people thought, reflected, processed things without even labeling it as something intentional. Now that space is gone, or more accurately, it's been replaced. Every gap has been filled, every pause has been optimized away, and what used to be empty time is now occupied time. And because of that, something important has shifted. We've lost not just silence itself, but the ability to comfortably exist in it. And when you lose that ability, you lose more than just a moment of quiet. You lose access to a certain depth of thought that only emerges when nothing is competing for your attention. Because deep thinking doesn't happen in fragments. It doesn't happen between notifications or in the brief seconds between switching tasks. It requires continuity. It requires space. And silence is one of the few conditions where that space naturally exists. Think about the last time you had a thought that felt genuinely original, something that didn't come from something you just watched or read or heard. For most people, those moments are rare. And when they do happen, they often happen in silence, when there's nothing else directing the mind. That's not a coincidence. It's a consequence of removing external influence long enough for something internal to fully form. But when silence is constantly avoided, that process never fully develops. Thoughts stay shallow, reactive, fragmented. They respond to input rather than emerging independently. And over time, that changes the way you experience your own mind. It becomes less of a source of insight and more of a processor of external information. Emerging independently. And over time, that changes the way you experience your own mind. It becomes less of a source of insight and more of a processor of external information. And that shift has consequences that aren't immediately obvious. Because when your internal experience is constantly shaped by external input, it becomes harder to distinguish between what you actually think and what you've absorbed. Your preferences, your opinions, even your sense of direction start to blur with the things you consume. And without silence, there's very little opportunity to separate those things. This is where things start to connect in a more practical way. Because if you don't have a clear sense of what is actually yours, it becomes much easier to move through life on autopilot. You follow patterns, you respond to expectations, you pursue things that make sense externally. But internally, there's a kind of disconnect that's difficult to articulate. It doesn't feel like something is wrong, it feels like something is slightly off. And that feeling is easy to ignore because it's not urgent. It doesn't demand immediate action. It just sits there in the background, subtle but persistent. And silence is one of the few things that brings it into focus. Not all at once, not in a dramatic revelation, but gradually, you start to notice small inconsistencies, things that don't quite align, thoughts that return again and again without being resolved. And the more time you spend in that space, the clearer those patterns become. At first, that clarity can be uncomfortable because it removes the ambiguity that allowed you to ignore those things in the first place. But over time, it becomes something else. It becomes useful. It becomes a way of navigating your own experience with more precision. And this is where the idea of psychological maturity comes into play, not as a label but as a capability. The ability to sit in silence without immediately escaping it is not about discipline in the conventional sense. It's about tolerance. It's about being able to remain present with your own internal experience without needing to immediately change it. That doesn't mean enjoying it. It doesn't mean finding it peaceful or relaxing every time. It means not being controlled by the need to escape it. And that distinction matters because it changes the relationship you have with discomfort in general. Or relaxing every time. It means not being controlled by the need to escape it. And that distinction matters because it changes the relationship you have with discomfort in general. When you become more familiar with the internal landscape, when you've spent time observing it without reacting to it, discomfort loses some of its urgency. It becomes something you can experience without immediately needing to resolve it. And that has broader implications than it might seem at first, because a lot of decisions, especially important ones, involve some degree of discomfort. Uncertainty, doubt, hesitation, these are all part of the process of making choices that actually matter. But if your default response to discomfort is to avoid it, to move away from it as quickly as possible, then those decisions become harder to navigate. You either rush through them to get back to a comfortable state, or you avoid them entirely. Silence, in a way, trains a different response. It creates a situation where discomfort is present, but action is not immediately required. You sit with it, you observe it, and in doing so, you realize that it's not as overwhelming as it initially feels. This realization is subtle, but it accumulates over time. Each time you stay a little longer, each time you resist the impulse to escape immediately, you build a kind of internal stability. Not in the sense that everything becomes clear or resolved, but in the sense that you become more capable of handling whatever arises. And that capability extends beyond moments of silence. It shows up in conversations, in decisions, in situations where things are uncertain or uncomfortable. You're less reactive, less driven by the need to immediately restore comfort, and more able to engage with what's actually happening. There's also another aspect to this that's easy to overlook, and that's the role silence plays in attention itself. Attention is not just about what you focus on, it's about how long you can sustain that focus without being pulled away. And in a constantly stimulated environment, attention becomes fragmented. It shifts rapidly, it reacts to whatever is most immediately engaging, and over time it becomes more difficult to maintain a single thread of thought. Silence counters that. It removes competing inputs, not completely, but enough to allow attention to settle. And when attention settles, it becomes more stable, more continuous. Single thread of thought. Silence counters that. It removes competing inputs, not completely, but enough to allow attention to settle. And when attention settles, it becomes more stable, more continuous. You're able to follow a thought further, to explore it more deeply, to stay with it long enough for it to develop into something more complete. This is particularly important for anything that requires depth, creativity, problem-solving, self-reflection. All of these processes depend on sustained attention. They require time and space, not just in terms of minutes, but in terms of uninterrupted mental continuity. Without silence, that continuity is constantly broken. Thoughts are interrupted before they can fully form. Ideas are abandoned before they can be explored. And the result is a kind of surface-level engagement with everything. With silence, even in small amounts, that pattern begins to shift. And this brings us back to something that might seem simple, but is actually quite fundamental. The ability to be alone with your thoughts is not just a preference, it's a skill. And like any skill, it develops with practice. The first few times you try it, it will feel uncomfortable. It might even feel pointless. Your mind will wander, you'll feel restless, you'll want to stop. That's not a sign that it's not working. That's the process of becoming aware of something that was always there. Over time, that experience changes. Not because the thoughts disappear, but because your relationship to them changes. You become less surprised by them, less reactive, more observant. And eventually silence stops feeling like something you have to endure and starts feeling like something you can use. Not in a utilitarian sense, not as a productivity tool, but as a way of staying connected to your own internal experience in a world that constantly pulls your attention outward. And that connection is not something you can outsource. It's not something that can be given to you through information or advice. It's something you develop by actually spending time with yourself without distraction. So, when you think about those 10 minutes again, it's not really about the duration. It's about the act itself. The willingness to sit in a space where nothing is happening externally and see what happens internally. And if you stay long enough, even just a little longer than you normally would, you start to notice something else. Nothing is happening externally and see what happens internally. And if you stay long enough, even just a little longer than you normally would, you start to notice something else. The discomfort doesn't just increase indefinitely. It peaks, it shifts, it changes. It becomes something you can observe rather than something you have to escape. And in that shift, something important happens. You realize that the thing you were avoiding is not as absolute as it felt. It's not something that controls you unless you immediately react to it. And that realization, even in a small way, changes how you move through everything else. Because once you know that you can sit with your own thoughts without needing to escape them immediately, the entire structure of how you respond to discomfort begins to change. And that's not something dramatic. It's not a transformation you notice all at once. It's subtle. It shows up in small moments, in pauses where you don't reach for your phone, in decisions where you take a second longer before reacting, in conversations where you actually listen instead of preparing your response. But those small shifts accumulate, and in time they create a different relationship with yourself, one that isn't mediated by constant input, one that isn't dependent on distraction to remain stable. And that's ultimately what silence offers. Not answers, not solutions, but access. Access to something that is already there, something that doesn't need to be created, only noticed. And once you've experienced that even briefly, it becomes something you can return to. Not perfectly, not consistently, but intentionally. And that's enough, because everything else builds from there.